visited Newfoundland and Labrador last year. I'm going to say Newfoundland and Labrador because that is the correct official title of that province. Karen's just going to abbreviate to Newfoundland because otherwise it becomes a bit kind of laborious. So that's the first thing. And her workshop today is based about the traditions and the culinary stories in that one province. And that's the one that's closest to the UK geographically and also closest historically, because actually up until about 60 years ago it was actually still part of the United Kingdom. They had a referendum and they decided they would become part of Canada. So as much as the recipes here today are rooted in English and a bit of Irish and a little bit of French heritage, if you travelled across Canada, you would find that every single province and territory would have a completely different story to tell. So whether it would be the French voyageurs who sort of populated Quebec, the Acadians who ended up in New Brunswick and then ended up in New Orleans, the Scottish in Nova Scotia, the Russians and Ukrainians who ended up out in the prairies after the programs, and then when you look at Vancouver on the west coast, you have this incredible influence of the Japanese and Chinese who were involved in building the railway. So everywhere is completely different. And that makes it very difficult to hang one peg on what is Canadian sort of cuisine. Because added into that, we have 4 very distinct seasons, which gives us very fine growing periods and things ripen and at the times they're supposed to and all these things. And so you've got this very distinct seasons, 3 coastlines that provide amazing seafood, the prairies with the wheat and providing, actually shipping lentils, which we leave back to India these days, providing mustard seeds for most of the Dijon mustard that you're probably eating is probably coming from Canadian mustard seeds. So these prairies are supplying the world with many ingredients. And whilst very many young chefs will come to London or Paris and New York and do their season here to hone their skills, they'll often go back home, or invariably end up going back home once they want to start a family, because they realise that the quality of life in Canada is going to offer them something more spacious and with their salaries and they'll get more for their money. So they go back and they take all these skills and things that they've learnt here, apply it to the incredible ingredients that they have there, plus the immigration patterns that influence all of this, and create something of their own. So whereas visitors to Canada tend to come for the wildlife and the amazing scenery and the adventure, they're often surprised by the fact that actually there is a very modern and fresh culinary scene. So that was really the main message that I wanted to go away a little bit inspired by the idea that for every story and quirky story that Karen's going to tell you about the one province that she went to, the Newfoundland and Labrador, I'll say it one more time, that in fact you could replicate those quirky little sort of nuggets of story ideas and ingredients times another 12. So please bear that in mind. I'm going to hand over to Karen and let you get on with what you do. I'm going to be around, so any questions you have afterwards, I'm happy to answer. Enjoy.
Thank you. Right, so first of all, I'd just like to say, can everybody hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm Karen, I've been introduced a couple of times. When I decided what recipes I was actually going to demonstrate tonight, it was actually quite tricky. Because obviously I'm at a venue which is very well equipped, but with limited time. So I went right back to the 3 basic recipes that I actually cooked alongside Newfoundland chefs in their own homes. When I say chefs, cooks, normal people. And so tonight, I'm going to be demonstrating 3 very simple recipes that I think resonate with all generations from the province, and probably will resonate with us as well, because there will be similarities. We will think, well, hang on, that's not Newfoundland recipe or cooking at all. And I'll come on to why. So when I went to Newfoundland last year, my primary objective was actually to sort of do some research on how recipes jumped the pond, as they say. Because of course Newfoundland's makeup of the population there come from predominantly Ireland and also the west coast of England, in particular Bristol and Liverpool. There's a smattering of northeast as well, some French, and long before we ever went over there was a Viking. The Vikings actually were in Newfoundland as well. But the recipes that I discovered by cooking alongside people in their homes were very similar that I recognise, such as fig duffy, bubble and squeak, not bubble and squeak, but bubble. So they're obviously, they've got their own derivation of the word. There was lobscouse, and there were all sorts of different recipes that we would recognise or probably think about as our own, but to them it go with their recipes as well. So tonight I'm going to demonstrate 3 very basic recipes that I cooked alongside Laurie, the island chef. The first one, you've all got recipe cards, is the Newfoundland petite buns, which are essentially scones, if you look at the recipe. But you can't call them scones, they are most definitely tea buns. Tea buns can be made with or without raisins. The recipe doesn't state to soak the raisins in screech rum, which I have here. Now I decided as an extra treat I'd actually soak the raisins in some screech rum. And why would Newfoundland have rum, you might ask? It's quite simple. They would send salt cod down to the Caribbean, and when the ships would come back, they wouldn't come back empty. They would come back with brown sugar, spices, and rum. So Newfoundland is probably one of the only places I've ever been to which is almost Arctic, where they have their own rum production. So I'm going to start off with the tea buns, and to cut back on time, I've already mixed my dry ingredients together. So that's my flour and my baking soda with a little bit of salt, and I've rubbed the butter in, because it would have taken me ages to rub the butter. Nobody knows how to rub butter in, what happens to you. So the next thing we do is we're going to actually add the rum-soaked raisins to the dry mix.
What's the percentage of rum?
Sorry?
What's the percentage of rum?
I sort of eyeballed it tonight, actually. It's probably a little bit over-generous. Should we say 4 tablespoons going on to 6, maybe? Because I've doubled the recipe, but it's, yes, between 4 and 6 tablespoons. So I'm just going to mix that.
Is tea a very established thing?
Yes, tea, not afternoon tea the same as we would see it, but high tea, which people often get confused between afternoon tea and high tea. High tea is a supper type tea, and it was called high because we sit at a high table and not sit at drinking around those small low tables and having dainty cakes and everything. So yes, tea buns would be served maybe as a snack when the children came home, maybe you had your lady friends over for a cup of tea or coffee in the afternoon. They can be served for breakfast as well. So I'm just stirring in the rum-soaked raisins there, and I'm going to add the egg and milk that I've already mixed. Again, I hope you don't mind, I've had to make shortcuts here because we don't want to be seeing cracking eggs and doing things away for the evening.
Yeah.
Yes. That's why I think a martini anyway, it's not far too long. Now, when I came to ask for the recipe for these tea buns, I was met with a wall of silence. Because it was Granny's recipe or it was Mum's recipe, it was a secret recipe. So I had to do a little bit of research. I went online, I sort of, I bought people drinks and bars, I sent chocolates over, and I finally got a recipe which was Granny's recipe. But if you look at the recipe card, of course a tea bun to us is a scone, or a scone, however you like to call it. So I thought it was an essential recipe to show you. It's what wives all over Newfoundland actually rustle up their husbands with their bake boxes. There's a good northeastern word for those who come from the northeast. I think I probably put a bit too much rum here, hence the animal. But that'd be wonderful. Yeah. So basically, but a scone mixture, as most of you know, it has to be fairly wet anyway, so we don't have it too dry. Yeah, maybe. And you can cut tea biscuits or you can doll it on like a fat rascal. You know, like a turf cake or something, you can actually just put them on a baking tray like that. Now, I was going to cut these tonight, but I'm going to use them fat rascal now. Right, so that's basically it. It's just flour, baking soda, salt, eggs, milk, and you don't have to have the rum and raisins. These are served in Newfoundland with cloudberry jam, which they call bake apple. Bake apple is their word for a cloudberry. Nim and I were discussing this earlier on. The version I've heard how it became called a bake apple is that when the French did go over there, they said bake apple. I mean, what is this berry? And from that, bake apple. But I think Nim's got another version. It's like beautiful bay. Yeah. Right, so I've got my boards, my trays already greased. Here, ready to go. Now Laurie actually made these freeform, but her mother-in-law, Regina, do you ever met Regina? I haven't met her. Yeah. She's formidable, isn't she? Yeah.
No, you didn't bring it.
She's formidable. So,
Very wet next.
actually, I say scone, in actual fact, I'm quite rock cakey as well. I've got a rock cake. And I had a discussion with them about our rock cakes, and they were going, really? You know, but they are very rock cakey. And they would actually eat them with jam and something called Fossils cream, which we call Nestles cream. Do you remember the tin cream? And one very desperate Christmas about 2 years ago, the island of Newfoundland, not the Labrador, it ran out of Fossils cream. And people were selling their grannies just to get hold of a tin of Fossils cream to go with their tea buns or their Christmas pudding, what have you. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to tell you a funny story about the next thing on the menu. And I'm going to be baby making, because it's pretty much obvious what I'm doing here is putting these on the baking tray to bake. I'm going to be making, have you all got recipe cards on your table?
Yes,
Is there something there spelled?
Two-ton.
Two-ton. So Teutons, is it?
Yeah.
Really? Let me tell you. I went over there, full of myself, thinking I'd have one from southwest France, and it's Teuton, of course. And I said to them, you know, I'm really excited about making these Teutons. And they all went, Teuton? I'm just going to pop this in the oven, I'll carry on. Teuton? And they kept going on about it, and I finally spelled it. They said, oh, you mean a town. So it's pronounced Towton. That's the first mistake I made. There's a couple of other mistakes as well. On my last day there, I was taken to a place called Fairyland for a picnic. I think I was telling Angela or somebody else. I remember it was -5, but the wind chill factor was about, I think, -15. And I was told I was going to Fairyland, and I was so excited. I said, "Do you know what a fantastic name for a place, Fairyland? Why do they call it Fairyland?" And she just looked at me. She said, "Beg your pardon?" I said, "That's such a magical name." She goes, "No, it's Fairyland." Oh, Fairyland. So anyway, there were lots of instances like that. So we've talked about where the recipes came from. A lot of Irish. There's the Irish Luke. Is that south?
Yes,
South of the island. Yeah, I went on the Irish Luke. So there's lots of recipes associated with Ireland, such as a jigs dinner, which is basically salt beef or corned beef boiled with cabbage, parsnips and carrots, and they also put a figgy duff in the same water. Well, it's a corned beef dinner, but they don't call it a jigs dinner. And I tried to get to the bottom of why it's called a jigs dinner. I suspect it's got something to do with an Irish jig, but nobody was able to tell me. So I don't think so very well. I'm sorry about that. It's like the wrong one, make it fine, it's right. So there's jigs dinner. The predominance of food in the island, somebody was asking me earlier on, is obviously fish. So fish, all fish is called by its name unless it's cod. If it's cod, it's called fish. Because if people know if it's fish, it's cod. And that's how it goes. Seals. Seal is quite prominent, but it's April to May seal season. They have flipper pie in St John's, and all of the supper clubs for the churches, the church supper clubs, they all have flipper pie. Moose. It's the flippers. It's the four flippers. So seals have, yes, it's a bit of a four flipper, and they actually make this pie. Apparently, you have to be born in Newfoundland to really to like this. I was told that.
Did you try it?
I didn't try it, but I did try. I tried seal charcuterie, which was very, very black and very fishy. It was absolutely vile, but I did try it because I thought, I have to. You've got to set your prejudice to one side, and they do. I was talking to somebody else earlier on. They do actually hunt to eat. It's not for sport. So therein lies the difference.
How's the export market?
I've just got enough room here just to pop one more on here.
I've never seen the seal anyway.
So this is just a simple tea bun, which is a bit like a rock cake or a scone. And obviously, if you're going to add loads of rum to it, like I did, it becomes a rock cake. So whilst those are baking, then can you tiny fork?
Yeah, I've just done it. I did it 10 minutes for the first one, so I did.
I'm going to go into the second recipe, which is the Newfoundland Towton. Now, Towton, everywhere, if you mention to somebody a Towton in Newfoundland, their eyes will mist over and they will talk about, a bit like, there are certain recipes that resonate all the way through generations. And if you, where I come from the northeast, or my grandparents came from the northeast, it's a stotty cake. So my mum remembers the stotty cake we put on the table and tearing it off and having crumbly Cheshire cheese and learn-pack butter for some reason. Learn-pack seems to feature quite a lot. And it doesn't matter wherever you come from, you know, their food resonates. Their Towton is, if you speak to anybody, they will remember it because it basically is the dough has been made the night before or the morning of the day, whatever's left. When the children would come home from school, they were hungry or waiting for something to eat, and so the mum would just tear off bits of dough and fry it. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. It's a fried bread pancake. So I'm just going to wrestle here with this. So that's what it is. It's a Towton is baked, so it's fried dough. So I just need to flour my board here. I made the dough already, it's been proving firm, it's had its first rise. You don't need it to go to its second rise, it just needs to be kneaded once and proved once. And then that's fine. So if you're an advocate of the special sort of artisanal dough you can keep in the fridge and just keep pulling the bread off. My grandma used to call it crock dough, actually, to put it in a crock. This is perfect, you can always make something hot and nourishing. They would serve it with butter, molasses and molasses. We thought it might be a bit messy to serve it with butter and molasses tonight, so we're going to serve it with cloudberry jam. So, and we've got some butter as well, butter. So I just need for the pan to get hot. Now, in Newfoundland, they wouldn't fry it in butter, particularly. You would fry it in something called scrunchions. Well, scrunchions is rendered pork fat, with like little bits of scrunchions in it, and so you would fry it basically in rendered pork fat.
Lard.
I didn't see lard there. Everybody always seemed to have sort of scrunchions. They seem to have this sort of rendered pork fat and pots of
In a
it.
solid block, like it
Yes, I do.
No, just like you have dripping. The old-fashioned sort of pots, like that. Right, now, what, the bread?
No, the scrunchions.
The scrunchions, you can buy it in blocks, because I saw it in blocks in the supermarket, but I never actually saw it in blocks in people's homes. It was always in a pot. I suspect they'd actually rendered it down even more. Another dish they have over there is called fish and brews, which is spelled B-R-E-W-I-S, and it's basically hardtack with salt cod. And you can see the links there with the fishing community, that they would go out, and what do sailors eat? They eat hardtack. But how do you make hardtack palatable? You soak it in water. This is exactly what fish and brews is. They think the word brews comes from the fact that a chef is asked to smash up the hardtack and to bruise it. But it's not spelled brews, it's spelled B-R-E-W-I-S, brewers, that's brews. It's an acquired taste. I wasn't quite sure if I liked it or not, because basically it's hardtack that's mixed with water and boiled.
Sorry, what's hardtack?
Sorry?
What is hardtack?
Hardtack is ship's biscuit. Yeah. It's a bit like a rusk, but very much harder. It's bread which is baked so double baked or triple baked. So it's baked so much that it becomes preserved in its baked form.
Thank you.
You have to tap it on the table to get the weevils out.
Yes.
Oh, you know.
I'm cooking it in butter tonight, and we're going to serve it with cloudberry jam. But you would serve it, you'd cook it in bacon fat, scrunchions, and you serve it with molasses and butter. And Newfoundland white bread is every housewife always has bread on. I never met anybody that. Yes, they buy ready-made sliced bread. Yes, they do. But every Newfoundland housewife still always have bread on. And she'll have the old-fashioned crock method that I talked about, where you'd have it, the everlasting bread, where you actually have it improve it to its first rise, you put it in the fridge or somewhere cool, you just tear bits off and you sort of, there was a book a few years ago, wasn't it, by an American author about artisanal bread or something, basically that's what it is. And what you do is you just take a small handful, little sort of handful, and you roll it into a ball. Let me move over here a bit. You flatten it a bit, like so. And since it's nice and hot, I'll just let it get a bit hotter. You fry, it's fried bread, it's fried bread pancakes, so I can't tell you how delicious it is. They will try and do anything with actually bread, but they can't, we send them round warm maybe, so it's not the same as it's cold. I swapped it over, and it says 10 to 15 minutes, so alright. They have spread by one, so I'll start putting these in. So these are tums, and if anybody has grandchildren or children at home, this really is a fantastic way to actually sort of, rather than sort of stuffing them full of crisps or something, if you actually have just a frying pan and a bit of butter and some dough already made, it's absolutely brilliant. Husbands as well, so my husband was like, over the moon. It was like, my God, fried bread, it's like my favourite things in one go. So that's the talcums on now. And we'll see them to start, when you do walk up, you see, people can't see, they're starting to puff up and rise now, so just try to just heat it so they don't burn underneath too quickly.
Good.
That's fine, they're doing fine. And so easy, I'm just rolling with balls, putting a bit of flour, flatten them out like so. And I think it's not like any recipe I know in the UK, but I can sort of see where they're coming from with it. It's something which is the grandmothers and your mums would make. It's simple food to feed the family on a budget. Because we're talking about bread here, it's yeast.
Comforting stock.
Exactly.
With cake.
And you have to they don't really have a lot that they can grow there, particularly, so you can have a vegetable patch.
So as I'm turning them over,
Made it yourself, so.
you can just see that there should be a nice sort of golden. And actually, that lorries are quite dark. Actually, I'm slightly darker. If you turn them over 2 or 3 times, maybe just turn the heat down so they're not cooking too much. You can see they're puffing up. And it's sort of like donuts in a way, really, isn't it? It's like a fried bread, which is like a donut.
Without a hole.
And talking about these sort of recipes that I think I discovered so much over there, I think a lot of it has to do with WI, because WI was founded in Ontario in 1897 by a farmer's wife. And I see a lot of this home cooking, and they have shows as well where they have blue ribbons in the top first prize. And I see a lot of this home cooking coming from the basics that we in the UK would actually get from the WI. You know, you sort of like the basics, how to make a sponge cake, how to do jams and preserves, marmalades, etc. So it's always quite simple, but you have to have a basic knowledge of it. Have you seen how they're puffing up here now? Can anybody see that? Look how they're puffed right up. I'll just turn them over.
Don't you think that they're beanies, and because there were an awful lot of Ukrainians who went to Canada?
But not in Newfoundland.
Not in Newfoundland.
Oh, not,
Yeah, to the
yeah. But I see where you're coming from, but not that. I think it's probably more to do maybe with Irish influence. Because one of the ladies I spoke to, Regina again, was quite a forceful lady, told me she was doing soda bread dough as well. So she was of Irish extraction, McCarthy, aren't they?
Bigorra.
Is I'm doing Newfoundland salt cod fish cakes, or they just call them fish cakes, of course cod is fish. And I desalinated some salt cod overnight and changed the water several times as well, so it's still not too salty. And I'm going to mix it with mashed potato and savoury, which is the special ingredient, which one of Nim's colleagues in Canada brought back from Newfoundland for me. It's dried savoury. And that gives its unique flavour apart from salt cod. So salt cod, mashed potato, onions and savoury. And that's the salt cod.
And what is savoury?
Savoury, well, it's winter savoury and it's summer savoury. You've got two types of savoury. You've got winter savoury and summer savoury.
And is that's again because of the you can't grow electricity around that, so they're coming down next.
They dry all their herbs. That's the question actually. One thing they do there a lot as well is they preserve, they bottle and preserve. When I went to Murray's house, she had bottled moose, bottled rabbit, bottled caribou, absolutely everything. She did all her own jam making, which is quite fascinating. All her own marmalade, all her own pickles, everything.
Since we're doing this up, I went to Sweden last summer.
Very, very similar. Very similar. If you think about the proximity of the geography though, and the other thing that they have in abundance over there, we're talking about Newfoundland ingredients, are berries. They have not just the cloudberry that we've talked about, which they don't call them cloudberries, they call them bayberries. They have dogberries, partridge berries, gooseberries, blueberries, marshberries, and they have all sorts of berries. Bilberries, everything. It's just incredible. Absolutely incredible. And you know how foraging has become very big here. Foraging over there may not be called foraging, but everybody goes out and forages for greenery all the time. A salad.
Would you just run through the berries?
Oh, sorry, yeah, that's very
So we've got dogberries, bilberries, marshberries.
just sounded so good the way we all I loved it. Can I do it again? Dear God. Sounds like one of those songs. Okay, we've got dogberries, partridgeberries, marshberries, blueberries, gooseberries, we have these blueberries, waterberries, cloudberries, which they call bake apple, and I got to call it dogberries, marshberries, partridgeberries. So, although we've had the most wonderful canapes served us today with Canadian ingredients, what I'm showing you is this is family cooking. It's what you do at home. And I'm not saying that all the food that I encountered over there was family cooking, because I went to some wonderful restaurants, which won Raymond's won the best restaurant in the whole of Canada for 2014. I want an accolade for a province as small as Newfoundland. It was Michelin star. Yeah, it was unbelievable. It was so good. But I also went to other places in St. John's. I used a place called Chinched, which made their own charcuterie. So they have this wonderful base of their own artisanal produce over there. They made their own charcuterie. I think that's where I tried the seal saucisson. They made saucisson, all sorts of different pans and everything, pâtés and terrines, and it was just marvellous. I then went, it was like a pub crawl with food. So I then went on down to another place where I was served black and white pudding. So there's, again, we've got the Irish and to a certain extent northeastern influence coming in with white pudding and black pudding. And they serve it with something called mother's pickle. And I was actually fascinated with this mother's pickle. I thought, I'm just going to have to find out what it means. And then it's mothers, isn't it? It's just their sort of colloquial way they say it, mother's pickle. And so that's why we've got piccolo tonight to actually go with fish cakes. Because it's traditional to serve that kind of pickle with fish cakes. So, yeah.
It's not mother's though, it's English.
So I think I'll make another couple more, and then we'll cut to pieces. I don't think I need to know more. Oh, I've got lots of food.
We go to
So basically, if you've got dough, you can make towns. Do try it in bacon grease or something like that, because it is absolutely delicious. And do try it with bacon grease and butter and the full sort of molasses thing as well, because that's fascinating. And as Lynn was talking about earlier on, we tend to forget that Newfoundland was a dominion, was a part of our colonies until 1949. It's that late. So I remember going to Wargrave in Singapore and Malaysia once, and seeing people from Newfoundland wondering all about it, because they fought in both world wars for us as a nation. Right. So, did you get all your berries? berries then, Miranda? You've got the berries.
Actually, so just thinking about the tea cakes. So do they add other things to that? Do they add the berries to those, or do they add?
Yes, you can add berries, but it's mainly raisins. And sometimes they get called raisin bombs. And also, there was one person who made them slightly flatter than that, and she called them raisin scotches. I think that comes from Scotch pancake.
Do they ever put any spices like cinnamon in it?
No.
Because these were really
No.
lovely flavour because of your rum.
But
And I just
it's
wondered-
really funny you should say that, because I asked about that. They use savoury a lot as a herb. But I didn't see many spices. Have you seen many spices? And yet you would
Probably
think,
would have been very expensive.
yeah.
Yeah.
And yet you would think with the connection with the Caribbean and the rum going back then you would. But I think the nature of their cooking is just so sort of home style, homespun, that maybe they didn't feel the need for spices to be put in there. They do put spices in the figgy duff, and they do figgy duff, which is a boiled pudding, which is plum duff maybe, so that's the thing where that comes from. Could you taste the rum in it?
It was delicious.
Yeah?
I certainly have more.
Yummy.
I like that.
That was good.
I'm glad to hear it. So I'm just going to wait for these to puff up and cook them a bit further, and then I'm going to do the fish cakes. I could have done all sorts of recipes, but I just thought that this, for me, epitomised the sort of like snack for the children with the bread, something as a treat that you serve your girlfriends or put in somebody's lunchbox. And they do some for breakfast as well, sort of more pancake style. And you have to do something with salt pod if you're actually coming from Newfoundland with a recipe, because it is the ingredient of the province.
What did you have for breakfast? What was it for breakfast?
Do you know what? You're going to be really sick when I tell you this. It was lobster Benedict.
For breakfast?
And that leads me very nicely on to another little anecdotal sort of tale I have to tell you about. The first night I was treated to a meal by one of the members of the Canadian Tourism Commission. That's correct, isn't it? Bernadette Walsh of Irish extraction. And she took me to a wonderful restaurant, and on the menu they said it's the end of May and the lobsters are just coming into season, and so we have fresh lobster. So I said, because I really wanted lobster, it's a bit expensive, and they just fell off their chairs laughing. So then I was regaled with this tale about how when Bernadette was growing up, and she came from a family of about 8 or 9, large Irish second and third generation family from Ireland, but they were so poor they couldn't afford meat, and so they could only eat lobster. And to actually hide this fact from all of her school friends, her mother, when they used to put the trash out, used to hide the lobster shells underneath everything else so the neighbours wouldn't see they were so poor they could only eat lobster. And it's not quite like that now, but it's not far off. Lobster is very, very cheap, and it's so they laughed when I had my lobster.
Growing up in Provincetown in the 1930s, I ate lobsters the way you eat Big Macs now.
And you know, it's a funny thing, John, because my mother was brought up in the northeast of England, near Sunderland, Newcastle, and my grandmother would take her down to the docks every Sunday when the fishing used to come, and they would buy a whole cooked lobster for a penny. They'd take it home and they'd just eat it with melted butter, and it was poor man's grub. So very similar to
As were oysters, of course.
Yeah, and oysters. Well, that's why oysters are added to Lancashire hot pot. Yeah. Right,
Similar
so
stories from Nova Scotia of families where if you came from a rich family, you had a peanut butter sandwich for lunch as a kid, and if you came from a poor family, you had a lobster sandwich.
I had both.
I think quite looking enough food tonight, actually, but I think my worries are Okay, well, now I've got that going, I'm not going to turn it off. So, I'm going to clear away a few bits and pieces and go on to the fish cakes, which is really awful. Karen, there's some tea cakes. Sorry? There's some tea cakes.
We all want
We all like the tea cakes. We have some more.
No, it's just I could smell something. I'm sure.
No,
I can see that little tray in there behind.
just what's allowed to come into here and say that. So they're out, thanks, but they are out. So that's the dough back here. Okay, so the fish cakes are made with salt, like I've already said, desalinated overnight don't forget to change the water at least 2 to 3 times. It's no good just to stick salt coloured water, bung it in the pantry and think next day it's going to be all right. You have to change the water because otherwise the fish is just sitting in salted water and you're not actually getting rid of the salt. It needs to be boned and skinned, and I bought this boned and skinned, and I will tell you now, I brought it back from France with me because we couldn't find any over here. It's morue, which for people who speak French is salt cod. And I found 5 bones in it, so I've gone through it, and then we'll verify this over and over again. I was just so devastated about this 5 bones. And I truly don't think there are any bones in there, but just be very careful. And the French would worry, they just go, they give a Gallic shot and say, you know, it's fish, it's got bones in it, but it was bought as de-skinned, to deboned. So what I have here is some fresh mashed potato, desalinated cod, which I've actually flaked and checked the bones several times over. And I've cooked some onions down here and put the savoury in. I'll just reheat those up as I've done before we arrived. Don't put any salt in for obvious reasons. As it's all cooked, it's not like a hamburger. You can, once you've mixed it, you can then taste it because obviously everything is cooked, so you can do that. If at that stage you need to add more salt, by all means add more salt. It says white pepper. I think we've got black pepper, but hey, the traditional recipe is white pepper. I think it's got to do with colour. I think a lot of people still think of white sauces, you know, you should put white pepper in rather than black pepper. I mean, we've become quite immune to black pepper all the time. So it doesn't say in the recipe card to add the savoury into the onions, but Nim and I were sort of like here, you know, sort of prepping. And I said, you know, let's put the savoury while the onions are still cooking, and the aroma was just amazing. And I think it's like when you're heating up curry spices and things like that, you always have to heat them up to release the aroma and to get all the oils and the spices going. And I think that's exactly what's happening here. So if you do want to recreate this at home, I advise putting the savoury in at the point where you actually cook the onions. It's very simple, as all the fish cakes are. So I'm going to add some mashed potato to my cod here. A bit short on some equipment. The mashed potato hasn't been seasoned overly. There's too much here in actual fact for the cod I've got, so I'm going to do half of it. And everywhere you go in Newfoundland, fish cakes are served predominantly for breakfast or brunch. It's got savoury now. Can you smell the savoury? I've just heated the onions up. It's absolutely fabulous fragrance. Can you buy dry savoury in the UK? I haven't checked that out yet.
I couldn't find it.
And you can buy the plant, winter or summer.
Yes.
And I've asked people if this is winter or summer savoury, and I suspect it's winter. No one's actually given me a definitive answer. Because the winter savoury is more pronounced in flavour, I think, in the summer. And summer is quite delicate, isn't it?
Did you find any chilies?
Sorry?
Did you find any chilies? Chilies, I think.
Chilies?
Yes.
Didn't see very many chilies.
No, not. It's not climate control.
No.
You've got to think where you would would be over in Vancouver, in the valley behind the mountains, coast mountains. They would probably be growing chili to supply the Asian communities in Vancouver. Probably find it growing there, but not so.
But not dry.
You probably find it
my
in a
mashed
shop,
potato
yeah.
and my fish in here with the onions and the savoury. It's just a matter of mixing it all together. It's very, very simple. The whole thing about tonight's demonstration is to really sort of, you know, like I said, we've had the most wonderful canapes. There is haute cuisine in Newfoundland. They have an extremely high fine dining scene over there with an enormous amount of passion and a renewal of their own identity. Because if I heard it once, I heard it 100 times, lots of Newfoundlanders who get called the Newfie, which is a very derogatory term, felt very much the butt of humour from the rest of Canada for a long, long time. But now they're coming into their own because they found mineral deposits in Labrador and oil, and they're now a very rich nation. And so forth, they've been elevated through the status of the Canadian provinces. And all of a sudden, with that raising of their sort of presence, their identity is also increased, and they have this real renewal of confidence. Very similar, actually, what we found in Northern Ireland. That sort of regeneration of confidence that comes, people have been down for a long time. We found the same when we went to Northern Ireland, it's very similar. But they haven't forgotten their roots. So, I went out foraging with an award-winning chef whose restaurant I'd been to the night before. He came out foraging with myself and Laurie the next day. We went to a lake and we foraged beautiful, wonderful greenery, salad stuff and herbs. And he was just as happy out cooking in a boiler, as they call it, a cookout. He actually cooked our food outside. It was amazing. We cooked mackerel, we cooked fiddlehead ferns, and we took tea cakes with us and bread and cold towns which we then reheated. And he was just as invigorated and passionate about cooking like that than he was the night before when he was doing haute cuisine and fine dining for us. So they haven't forgotten their roots and they're very, very much in touch with these simple recipes which the grandmothers and mothers would put on the table for them. So don't try not to overmix it. And one of the notes in the recipe you will see is don't overwhip your potato because you know it's glutinous and gluey. So want it quite light and fluffy. Again, this would be fried in scrunchions, in bacon. I'm actually going to see if this pan here, so I'll use that one.
Let's see if I can get this one washed. We've got two of them.
They're both flashing now, which is weird.
Do you just want to use this one as well?
Still flashing out. I'm really sorry about this, because what happened is that when you put the equipment list in, you didn't realise this is induction, you can only use certain pans. So it was a bit of a panic moment. So of course, I'm going to make the fish cakes and then flour towns, these little balls, and then make them into small fish cakes. They served them for the canapes. They were more like canals that you had earlier on, weren't they? But I'm actually going to make a proper fish cake. Fish cakes.
Did you say you were able to buy some funny items?
You probably can.
Someone gone to, building site.
Oh, it's very delicate. Any recipe is roses.
Yes.
Nice, yeah, but it's gone again because it's flashing. So you see what I've done, just very lightly, you don't need much flour. If you've got anybody who's gluten intolerant, obviously use something else like crushed cornflakes or rice flour or gluten. Yes, thanks very much. I'm just going to shake them then before I put them together. So little balls. You can still see the flakes of the cod. They're still discernible in there, which is what we want. And then just flatten them out slightly. And we all know how to make fish cakes, I'm sure. And the savoury, I put in the end about 2.5 teaspoons in, and you should be able to see it reflect throughout the actual fish cake.
Karen, when you said they're eating for breakfast, when you said they were eating for breakfast, what would they have them with? Would they just have them on their own?
Fish cakes?
Yes.
They had a white pudding and piccalilli.
Sorry, what was the first thing?
White pudding.
White pudding.
And piccalilli.
Like
One
that
of the
pudding sausage.
institutions of Newfoundland is Halliday's white pudding.
Right.
This butcher called Halliday, he makes all the white pudding, he has like the whole, everything that comes from him. They do have black pudding as well, but and spices. Their black pudding and white pudding are quite highly spiced. The spices come into the black and white pudding. So they would have it. Some photos on my site actually how I ate it. But they would have the fish cake with a dollop of piccalilli and a slice or two of white and black puddings.
And that would be the start of the day, and that would, in theory, you wouldn't need a snack after that.
Keep going.
What do you eat for lunch and dinner? Lobster. Lobster.
So the main ingredients of the province are fish, seafood, not so much scallops in Newfoundland. I found there's more in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia I think it's called Digby scallops, which are just unbelievable, fantastic. And rabbit, which aren't really rabbits at all, they're hares. American hare is. There's absolutely scallops, they're fantastic. Sorry? Why is it Digby scallops? They're the biggest meatiest, juiciest, sweetest scallops I've ever tasted. And I think it's something to do with seafood, which is raised in cold water.
Yeah.
Digby.
Digby is actually the name of the port,
Yeah.
the harbour, which is actually in a body of water called the Bay of Fundy, which is protected on both sides. So, yeah, the Bay of Fundy. And it's one of these bays that has the highest tide in the world. So it's a big body of sweet water coming through on the tide. And then it's pretty colder, but it's also a bit protected. So the Digby scallop, the fishing sort of beat down to Digby across all of Canada and North America would be known as these prime scallops.
But there's a
dimes. Are they dimed?
No, those ones
No,
aren't. There are other areas.
Yeah, they do hand diving. There's a big sort of battle between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia about who has the best lobster. Because I went to both provinces, and I heard both sides of the story. And when I was in Newfoundland, they said, you know, don't taste the lobster in Nova Scotia, it's just not right. It's too far south, the water's far too warm. This is Nova Scotia we're talking about. I'm not talking about the equator. When I went to Nova Scotia, they said to me, don't ever eat lobster in Newfoundland, it's just foul, it's, you know, they don't melt or something, or their shells don't melt, and you know. So,
Tasted fine to you.
yeah, they did, yeah. So it's quite funny. Other interesting
I guess it's that yellow corner.
it is, isn't it? The other thing which fascinated me over there, which isn't in Newfoundland, but is in Nova Scotia, and I'll tell you whilst I'm picking these fish cakes, is the wine production over there. I went to 4 vineyards on the last day before I actually flew out, and their viticulture over there is unbelievable, because they've actually developed the grape which will stand to a certain extent of permafrost and actually ripens later on in the year, so their wine is harvested much later, and it withstands the cold. And I think that grape was invented in Ontario, I think actually in Ontario, the science behind it. I actually visited organic vineyards in Nova Scotia, and some of them actually won medals throughout Canada, which was fascinating as
What's
well.
the lessons using?
I don't know, I'll have to check.
It's actually on a line with Maine and Newfoundland, that sort of,
The other thing, I was talking about Jig's dinner. I spoke to a friend who lives in New England recently. He told me that a Jig's dinner is not Newfoundland at all. It's called a Boston dinner. So there's all sorts of things, because they obviously had people who settled there, have corned beef, fried, so boiled with cabbage as well. The Jig's dinner I was invited to, because I was a special guest of honour, was very flattering. They did not only did they do salt cod and feed off, which was her grandma's recipe that she gave me. I'm not allowed to share. Maybe buys me a martini after as I might. Was they actually cooked a turkey to go alongside. Have you heard that? They do turkey with it as well. I think that was one of the extras. Newfoundlanders are the most friendliest people I've ever met in my life. And I remember Hinton when I came back, and she'd been seeing a Canadian blogger off at the airport when I was coming in after a red-eye flight. And she was saying, how was it? It was fantastic. And I said to her, friendly, she goes, scary, isn't it? And it is quite scary, because they are so friendly. I went to people's homes, and they shared cooking with me, they shared their family. You know, it was wonderful. I was very privileged, because I wasn't there. I didn't just go there and observe. I went there and engaged with them as well, which I think, as a cook, or someone who's interested in food, has to be, you know, the sort of the icing on the cake, really.
And that is their natural way.
Yeah,
That's not because
what's
they
the
use
difference?
that is the natural way. I mean, this is a community where they don't really even lock their doors.
No.
They don't need to. It's a pride. You know, when I went there, I kept locking the car door, and she kept saying to me, "Why are you locking the car door?" And I went, "All my things are in there." And she said, "Well, no one's going to take it because everybody."
Population?
No, the population.
I don't know.
No, I wouldn't want to give a figure. It's going to be less than that.
There was another funny story I haven't told you yet. I landed in Newfoundland in one of the worst days of the year for fog and rain. So we had a category 3 landing, which the Canadian pilot told us was going to be a category 3 landing. So I'm thinking, what's a category 3 landing? It sounded pretty scary. Whereas it was auto. landed because he couldn't see where he was going, basically. So I turned up, and it's chucking it down with rain, and I wasn't phased. I thought, this would be wonderful. I was led by Bernadette Walsh from the City Tourism Board. And half an hour later, after landing, I was sat with my feet under the director's table in the Kiddie Biddy Brewery, drinking an iceberg beer. Fantastic. And who wouldn't want to land in the country and sort of, be treated like that? So anyway, so he then gave me a 6-pack of beers to take back to the hotel. So I went back to the hotel, and I'm, really excited about this whole trip anyway. And I walk in, and the receptionist saying, "Oh, you've got some iceberg beer there." She goes, "Fantastic beer, I love it. Sitting on the porch in the summer with iceberg beer." And again, yeah, fantastic. It's great when it's chilled. She goes, "Oh my God." She goes, "I don't think your room has a fridge." So I said, "Well, never mind, sort of that." She goes, "No." Anyway, so I went into my room. 5 minutes later, there's a knock on the door, and this young guy was there with this fridge. I told me in a fridge. And he reels it in, he goes, "Well, let's just find and he plugged the fridge in, and he said, "Shall I put the beers in?" And he went. It was unbelievable. And that, what's the hotel I see that it was the Sheraton? Yeah, so it wasn't just like
Was it Delta? Was it the Delta?
No, it's Sheraton, yeah. So we're not talking about like a little hick town bed and breakfast here where they might do that. We're talking about a nationally acclaimed and well-known hotel chain that told the porter to bring up the beer to the room. So then she phones up and says, "Have you got your fridge?" I go, "Yeah, thanks so much, but it's fantastic." And she goes, "Is the beer cold enough yet?" She goes, "Because if it isn't, I've got some iceberg ice." I'm going, "Ha ha ha ha," said iceberg ice. And she must have thought I was a bit mental. So another 5 minutes passes, a knock on the door, and somebody else turns up with this big polythene bag filled with ice. So if you think iceberg ice is like ice, normal ice, you are so totally wrong. Because you have to think about the science behind it. It's compressed water over thousands and thousands of years. So I take the ice out, and she's very proudly standing there. She goes, "I've got a little hammer, we can smash it up." So we smash it, and it's like fairy dust or fairy lights. Each little piece has got prisms of light going through it where the water has been compressed down. And it looks like it's got glitter inside it. It's just amazing. I was so fascinated. I was photographing. I had it on the window. I was tweeting it. 4 minutes of, get over the ice now. There's plenty more. And I then, probably rather foolishly, because it thus ensued a discussion for about 20 minutes. How do they get the ice? And they have iceberg wranglers who go out in these special boats, because they're quite dangerous, because you think they're top. Because you only see the race, they're bottom heavy. And they wrangle these icebergs, actually into Kiddie Biddy, actually, down there, and they actually sort of harvest them there and actually get the water off. If you taste iceberg beer or iceberg water, it is soft and pure and like nothing you've ever tasted before. It's just amazing. Now, these fish cakes should be ready now, so I've just fried them until they're golden brown, just a little bit of flour.
Leon, do you know what the kids eat at lunchtime at school in Newfoundland?
I did ask, and they do have school dinners, and I think it's the same as in the UK. Some kids take sandwiches, some children have school dinners. I think they've got a very good school dinner policy over there in Newfoundland, actually. I know that the university has the most amazing refectory because one of the girls from the Tourist Commission was telling me that she just finished her master's there, and she was telling me what they were actually offered in their refectory, which is unbelievable.
Thank you.
So there's no egg in these, it's just the ingredients I told you, and they should be pretty much done now. Of course, in the UK, after you make the mixture, you normally put it in the fridge to chill. They say that on the recipe card you must deal with everything while it's warm. So, and that's how Laurie, the lady that I did speak to, would actually do it as well. So we'll send it in, cut this into quarters and send them round. So that's the end of the cookery demonstration, such as it is. me and many people from the Canadian Tourist Commission very kindly provided recipe cards for everybody. I have a wealth of other recipes that I was given when I came back from the province. I'm very, very happy. If anybody emails me, I'm quite happy to share recipes or any other little tips or anything. And I also have 2 beautiful books that were presented to me when I left there, Newfoundland Treasury of Recipes and another book called Back Fat and Molasses, which are out of print. And I photocopied a few pages to bring along to sort of like something of my talk. I haven't really referred to that, because I didn't actually remember it. I'm very happy if anybody who has a specialist interest, I will scan them and I will email them to anybody if there's anything that, that is covered in the books. So I might not have enough cards tonight, but obviously in the guild member will take my email on the site anyway. Hope you've enjoyed what I've done. Very sorry about these problematic sort of cooking here, but they're out of control really. I'm trying really hard. Something made far too much, but
Thank you very much.
Just before I maybe don't get the chance, there is a little goodie bag for each of you to take home with some Canadian ingredients in there. One of them being a little mini bottle of ice wine. We were hoping to do a tasting with some special ice wine glasses that Riedel do. Unfortunately, they couldn't get them over in time, so I've just given you the bottles to take home and try at your own leisure. And there's a few other bits and pieces. Some you'd expect and some you wouldn't expect.
Thank you very much.